Okay, I wanted to take a few minutes to just spend a little bit of time kind of, going over a few things in terms of talking about deception with data. And right now, regardless of, what position you're in here, if you're in the watching anything in the media, you're just completely overwhelmed with what's going on right now. And I see things as a data science person that just continues to frustrate me, and even more so, how people kind of become gullible and fall for it. So let's talk about an example, and we're gonna avoid the current state here. So I'm gonna dive in here with what I consider a fairly neutral example. So let's talk about first interpretation of statistics. Okay, so let's say, for example, one person out of every 1,000 dies of something. Let's go with something non-controversial here. Let's say eating meatloaf. Okay, so our simple math is this, right? 1 divided by 1,000 gets us 0.001. Okay, so the math on that says 0.1%. Okay, so a tenth of a percent of our population is negatively impacted by consumption of meatloaf. All right, can we all agree on that math? I hope so. So again, in basic terms, we're going to say, a tenth of a percent. All right. Now, here's the problem. How does this get reported in the news? Okay, so insert the name of a prominent news outlet, and I don't care, what political affiliation you are. They both have their shortcomings, so we won't specifically state one. All right, so you'll see something like this: in sad news from around the world, a person died today from consuming meatloaf. Gasp! This comes as troubling news as millions of people a day enjoy meatloaf. Leading experts urge Americans to exercise extreme caution when consuming meatloaf. Oh my, this resonates, doesn't it? Okay, now, for sake of argument, let's go ahead and say that a couple days later, another death is reported. All right, so we're going to redo our math, aren't we? So now the math is 2 divided by 1,000, okay, our sample population, if you will. Okay, so now that gives us a answer of 0.002, or 2/10 of a percent. So now, as a scientific person, we would say that 0.2%, or 2/10 of a percent of our population died as a result of meatloaf consumption. Okay, we can all agree on this, right? Now, here's where it becomes even more problematic. How does the news report this? Again, we go back to our insert the name of prominent news outlet. Live breaking, continuing our story from last night, we must now report that the death rate of meatloaf consumption has now doubled since we last broke this story. Okay, so now the news is saying, okay, your risk has now doubled of death if you continue to consume meatloaf. Okay, people are now throwing out the meatloaf pans, swearing off meatloaf forever. Okay, was the news telling the truth? Well, sure, they were, right? Technically, they were. The death rate did, in fact, double. It went from 0.1% to 0.2%. Okay, the average person doesn't think about it this way, though, when we hear something has doubled. All right, we hear doubled, and that's bad news, right? Okay, let's talk about our 401k. We like to see that double, don't we? Okay, all right, so what's the bigger problem? Okay, we got to look at this big picture. How do we know for certain how many people really ate meatloaf? Okay, how did we get to that number of 1,000 people ate meatloaf? Okay, probably did it via sampling, right? Okay, so we don't know for sure. Okay, so all we know with some degree of certainty is how many people died. Okay, and we could be off on that as well, right? Okay, next, we don't actually have great data on this. Okay, so we pulled it from sampling. Okay, we don't know how many people accurately reported. Okay, we can also look at regional differences, right? I think most of us would probably agree that meatloaf is more of a Midwestern thing. Where did we sample? Did we sample on the East Coast? Okay, did all the people we sampled of our 1,000 population, were they all buying ground beef from the same place? Okay, all factors that our study likely did not include. Okay, so let's really raise the question. Let's say it was actually 10,000 people consumed meatloaf, not 1,000. Okay, so we've increased by a huge factor here. Okay, so our numbers now become what you see below. Okay, 1 out of 10,000. Okay, now we're way down there. Okay, 0.0001. Okay, or 1/100th of a percent. At 2 people, we can see we're 2/100ths of a percent. But again, it would still be us saying that our impacted population doubled. Agree? So start to think about things from this perspective. Okay. Now, the next thing I want to bring up to you is something that we call anecdotal evidence. Okay. And we see this, the media has perfected this like none other. You've all seen it. And sadly, you've all probably been guilty of this in times. Okay. Without even thinking of the impact. Okay. So let me give you a scenario here. But first, let's define it. By definition, anecdotal evidence is evidence collected in a casual or informal manner and relying heavily or entirely on personal testimony. Okay? Not overly scientific, is it? Okay? And think about what you see on the news all the time. It's filled with anecdotal evidence. All right? So let's give a scenario. Again, we'll go back to our insert name of prominent news outlet. Okay? Everyone in the trailer park just loved Karen, and her meatloaf was just the best. We're all so sad. I just woke myself up in tears today, even thinking about meatloaf. Please do not eat meatloaf. Okay, and you've all seen it on the news. They typically pick the person that is going to get your attention. Usually, it's not the most well-spoken person, but here we have personal narrative, right? And maybe they'll interview the neighbors and really kind of pull on those personal emotions. Is it sad? Absolutely. We feel bad about Karen, but this is anecdotal. Okay. So here's where it really becomes a problem. Okay. Well, we'll all agree, nobody wished anything bad on Karen. Okay. Even if we didn't know her, we're humans, and our human nature is we want the best for people. Right. Okay. But this is textbook anecdotal, right? It's a personal narrative, and now it begins to resonate. And watch how easily this happens. And yes, this example is a little crude, but this is exactly how it portrays itself, okay? So Billy Bob, who lives next door to Karen, is going to go fishing tomorrow, and he's going to tell all of his guys at the fishing hole. He's going to say, hey, I got to tell you about my neighbor Karen. She ate meatloaf, okay? And now Billy Bob's buddy, Scooter, hears it, okay? He goes home and he puts it on the Facebook, and he says, my buddy's neighbor, Karen, died from eating meatloaf. I'm not sure what really happened, but I tell you what, I'm not eating any more meatloaf. And then they go ahead and push it over the line by saying, please post and share. Okay? So now you've got this thing that maybe it starts to go viral, and everybody that's friends with Scooter on Facebook is now sharing this. And now suddenly some guy that's 5 degrees of separation from Karen reads this and shares it out to his friends. Doesn't know Karen, doesn't know the surrounding circumstances, but all they know is meatloaf is bad. Okay? So, where does this leave us? Could meatloaf be deadly? Maybe. Maybe not. Okay? Full disclosure, I'm not a fan of meatloaf, so that's why I kind of picked the example. I don't think you should ever bake hamburger, but that's a side note. I always find it interesting that when you tell people you don't like meatloaf, they get offended, even if you've never had theirs, and then their immediate rebuttal is, well, you should try my meatloaf because it's good. No, it's not. I don't want your meatloaf, but thank you. Okay. Is the data that I portrayed to you accurate? Probably not. It's not complete. Okay. We could probably be certain that, one person died, two-person died, that sort of thing. That's fairly easy to measure. But the other variables in this equation aren't so easy to measure. Okay. So let's ask ourselves the golden question, though. I've given you my bias. I'm not a fan of meatloaf. Okay. So should we be cautious of meatloaf? Like I said, I don't think you should bake hamburgers, so I'm not a fan, okay? That being said, let's say I loved meatloaf, okay? The scientific answer here is you don't know. You need to dig deeper, okay? So look real close at your sample, okay? That 1,000, or let's say it's 10,000, is it truly representative, okay? Are there underlying issues with my sample, okay? Look at how that sample was actually collected. Okay, again, I mentioned earlier, was it regional? Did I collect data from just people in a given regional area? Did I look in a certain demographic group? Did I look in a certain socioeconomic class that could potentially skew the data? Okay, so most importantly, proceed with caution. Okay, I'm not saying ignore this data and swear off meatloaf for the rest of your life. Meatloaf could be bad. Meatloaf could be perfectly fine. Okay. Bottom line, don't take your chances until you know for sure. And we should never evaluate our decisions based on anecdotal data that you see on Facebook or simple mathematic computations that are then interpreted in ways that lend themselves to confusion. So you're going to have an assignment where I'm going to kind of challenge you on some of this stuff to really dive into an example and come away with this and decipher, do I have valid data? And if I do, what conclusion should I make? But the other end of it is going to be, this data probably isn't complete. What additional questions do I need to raise? And where else do I need to look to truly take a scientific approach and form an opinion? Okay, so look for more details on that here shortly.